A concept is a mental representation of a category of items in the world. So the conceptual representation that we have are mental organizations of knowledge that we have about the different categories of things that we store in our long term memory. The classical approach to concepts was as a definition. And this is the way the ancient Greeks, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. This is basically what they did. And essentially what they would do is they would come up with a definition of a particular concept. So for example, a bird, furniture, chairs. They would simply come up with a definition and say this is the set, a bird is something that meets has these features, and they are the necessary and sufficient features for identifying something to belong in a particular category. And like I said, this served us well for 2,000 years, starting with the early Greek philosophers. But up until about the middle of the 20th century is when things sort of went awry, mainly because of the nature of language. We had philosophers who started studying the nature of language and realizing that coming up with concepts, hard and fast rules for concepts, was not as easy as it looked. So there were some theoretical problems with the old way of looking at concepts. So one of the most famous examples of this came from Ludwig Wittgenstein, who in 1953 argued against the definition approach, mainly because he said he came up with lots of examples showing that it's impossible to come up with a definition that satisfies a lot of different types of concepts. So what he came up with was this notion of family resemblance, saying that members of a particular category share this family resemblance, and that was what a family resemblance is when you define concepts by a series of overlapping similarities. So you can think of this as like with the example, of course, is based upon this notion of uh, family resemblance in family. So my son, for example, looks a lot like me. Our daughter looks a lot like my wife. You can tell when people are related because there are certain features that they have that overlap with other members of the family. And this is the way you should understand Wittgenstein's notion of family resemblance. That there are certain features that in a category that overlap. So one of the big examples that we use in this literature a lot is the idea of a game. What is a game? What are the essential features of a game? So it has rules, it has competition, there's winners and losers. There are a lot of things that overlapping features that could be argued are like the family resemblance features for the category of a game. Um, Other types of empirical work was done where we were looking at how people form and use categories. So McCloskey and Glucksberg in 78 reported that we do not treat all members of a category equally. As a matter of fact, that there are some uh, members of a category that are better members than others. So, for example, in the category birds, right, we know that the little songbirds that we see everywhere, chickens, penguins, and ostriches are all birds. However, we don't compute ostriches the same as we do songbirds because ostriches just don't look like birds. Penguins don't look like birds. We don't compute them the same as we do songbirds. They're following up related to this topic is the work of Rausch and Mervis, I should say. where they talk about where they did work on the typicality rating. So basically, what they did was they gave people lists of objects or lists of things that belonged in particular categories, like furniture, birds, games, and they had them rate how typical is this particular object of this category. So, a songbird, like a little robin would be rated highly typical bird, and a penguin would be rated low in typicality. In this, from this we've come up with a typicality effect, where basically it's a result where the more common members of a category show a processing advantage. So in other words, if I present you with a picture of a songbird, and I ask you, is this an instance of a bird? Yes or no? You'll answer that question a lot quicker than if I presented you with a picture of a penguin. The penguin, you would delay a few milliseconds because you're like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't look like a typical bird, but I remember from my biology classes in fourth grade that was a bird, so bam, it's a bird. Typical items are always the first ones that are produced when you're asked to produce a category member. So if I ask you to produce give me a picture, give me in your mind's eye, form a picture of a horse. Well, you're going to pop up this the typical picture of a horse, right? It's going to be a side view of a horse, right? It's probably going to be like a brownish horse, right? With a light colored mane and a light colored tail. That's what most people come up with. And those are the sorts of typical things that people come up with when they're first asked to produce a member of a category. So here's a great example of a listing of the items that Roche and Mervis in 75 had people go through. So basically, the different categories we have here are furniture, weapon, and clothing. And at the top of the list of furniture, for example, we have chair, sofa, and table. Very typical pieces of furniture. At the very bottom of the list, we have closet. That's interesting, right? You've seen those big bureaus, those giant, closets. A vase, which they do have huge, big ass vases that are essentially pieces of furniture. And a telephone, believe it or not, a telephone. Back in the day, they had like these telephones that were like built into little tables. And which is, for all intents and purposes, that's a piece of furniture, but it happens to be a telephone. So we have this range of typicality going from most typical to least typical. The problem basically with this classical approach is, and the problems that we've identified are that there's no clear, necessary, and sufficient features for that always work. You're always going to find exceptions if you come up with a definition of something. There's no clear boundaries to say this is no longer a cup; it is now a bowl. Right? It has now become a bowl. Right? There's no clear boundaries, and then we have these typicality effects. Right? In other words, a definition shouldn't have this typicality effect. If you have this hard definition that is very good, then and a particular object should either be in that category or not be in that category. There's no in between. It's like being pregnant. You can't be a little pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not, right? And it's the same thing. You would think that definitions should be the same thing, but they're not. We have all these weird typicality effects. There's all these exceptions. There's no clear boundaries. So we really had to come up with better ways of figuring out how it is that people actually form concepts and use concepts. Well, one of the alternative approaches to the definitional approach was the prototype approach. And this was really the first major theoretical foundation that was put forth as a result of some of this early research that I mentioned earlier. Essentially, what it is what it says is that concepts are abstract representations or prototypes that summarize the common and distinctive attributes of all the members of a particular category. So, for example, birds. As you grow up and you learn about birds, you have this image of a bird when you're little that you learn from the picture books, and then you grow up and you see birds and you learn more and more about birds. That prototypical bird that you started forming as a child changes over time, because what you're doing is you're averaging in all of your experience that you've had to create this prototype of this category known as bird. So the prototype is essentially just a weighted average of all the features of all the members. Not all the so here's an example, right, of a list of features for game, right? So we have bridge, and then there's two games I've never heard of: Beyond Balderdash and Ticket to Ride, and then Yahtzee, which who doesn't love Yahtzee, right? And then playing catch back and forth. One of the features that is common to all of these different games is played for enjoyment. Games are played for enjoyment. If it's not enjoyable, then it's not a game; it's work, right? So, it's something that has to be enjoyable. Players have to compete. Um, there's taking turns, using some sort of tools, some sort of keeping track. All of these things are features for the concept of a game, and you can sort of average all of these to come up with a sort of a prototype for what games are. Another approach, aside from prototypes, it's kind of like prototypes, but not really like prototypes. It's the exemplar approach. Now, basically, what this says is that concepts consist of separate examples or separate representations of examples that you've experienced in that category. And basically, so for each category, you have this little set of examples that you say, these examples constitute anything that looks like these examples is a member of that category. Now, it's kind of like the prototype approach, because you're comparing it to to different examples, but not it's not like the prototype approach, because in the prototype approach, you crunch together all of the examples that you see to form like one common prototype. With the exemplars, you don't do that. You don't crunch them all together. You hold them all in your category as different examples of that category. And then, so the more or less typical of a concept an object is, the more similar it will be, and it'll be recalled as being a member of a particular category. Categorization is just basically accomplished by comparing something that you've come across to all of your exemplars, your memories of exemplars of similar things. So if you see a new bird, if it looks like every other bird, then you'll know that it's a bird. If you happen to be going, somewhere and you see, if you're in the South Pole and see penguins, well, you may not recognize them as penguins right away, unless you happen to know that penguins should be part of your list of exemplars in your category for birds. So here's an example, right? So we go through and we say, oh, okay, here's the bird example. So I come across this particular bird here that you see here at the top on the left. And I go through all my recalled birds that I've seen in the past. And I categorize this new thing that I've seen, as a bird. Over on the right-hand side, we see, oh my God, what is that? It's an ostrich. Well, it does not look like a bird. From the list of recalled exemplars, it could be a goose, could be an emu, Could be a llama even, but it sure as heck doesn't look like a bird, right? Barcelou in '95 talked about this notion of goal-derived concepts. So one of the really tough things about you know looking at prototypes or exemplars, well, there's another layer of complexity here, and that is this: that apparently, not only do we go on the appearances of how something looks to categorize it, we also base our categorizations on how things are used, what they do, what we can do with them. So Barcelo came up with this notion of goal derived concepts, which are related to achieving certain goals. And basically, what this is these are categories of things that are grouped together based on how well they satisfy a particular purpose. Right? So, for example, kitchen utensils, dining utensils, those are all categorized under a similar concept because we use them to eat. So, what Barcelo did was he measured three variables, all of which were equally important. And the three variables he looked at were, first of all, central tendency, a measure of family resemblance. So kind of like Wittgenstein's thing, where we say, okay, what is the in a particular category, what are some of the common tendencies of everything? The other thing he looked at was frequency of instantiation, how often an item was considered a member of a category. So is it really considered by everybody a member of a category, or are there fewer people that would consider it as a member of a category? And then finally, the ideal, how well an item satisfies a particular goal. So if the goal is eating, digging, spraying, killing, whatever, how well does that item satisfy that particular goal? And by putting those three things together, he was able to come up with this really interesting notion of uh, building certain concepts based on that. So the exemplar and the prototype approaches do depend on observable features. The problem with goal directedness is that it's problematic because goal directedness is abstract. I mean, you have to like visualize what you're doing with a particular object. You can't just look at it and say, "Oh yeah, that looks like a bird, so it's a bird." You have to like look at it and go, okay, well, you have to know how it's used and what it's used for and visualize it being used. So it's kind of problematic to come up with exemplars using goal directedness, because goal directedness is so abstract. It's not like uh, colors or shapes or anything like that. Um, Cohen and Murphy talked about this notion of um, prototypes being based on uh, that prototypes, remember prototypes, just the averages of examples, are represented best as schemata. So basically, like a scheme structure, like a network, then as just simple lists. Murphy and Medin talked about this notion of, well, you know something, there these theories that are based on how similar things are to each other, they don't work very well. So these theories like prototype theories and exemplar theories, yeah, they're kind of cool. They explain some things, but they probably our categorization is probably a lot more um a lot more complicated than that. As a matter, our concept, our system of concepts is probably based a lot more on our perceptions of how we use things and work things than just symbolic lists of things like colors and shapes and sizes and whatnot. So whatever our concepts are, whatever they are, prototypes, exemplars, or some mix of perceptual work, use, whatever, right? Whatever they have to be organized. They have to be organized in such a way that we can get to them and use them quickly. Uh, it's probably the case that our concepts are organized in hierarchies. Now, of course, a hierarchy means that there's like categories that are higher than others and categories that are lower than others. And of course, we do have these, categories. Uh, for example, um, we have a category of animal, and below that category of animal, we have feline. And below that category of feline, we have lions, tigers, and house cats. Below the category of house cat, we might have like Siamese cats and tabby cats. And then below tabby cats, we might have, my cat named Twinkie, right? So I have these different, hierarchy of categories going from very specific things at the very bottom to very general things at the very top. Categories that are above other categories are superordinate categories. So, for example, animal is superordinate to feline because animal comes above feline. And then the categories that are below other categories are subordinate categories. So house cat is subordinate to feline because house cat is just one instance of many different types of feline. Subordinate categories inherit the properties of their superordinate category. So, for example, felines. If I know a particular critter is a feline, right there, I know a lot about that critter. I know that it's a hunter. It eats meat. I know its general shape. Maybe I even have an idea as to maybe how big it might be. So I already know a lot about a particular critter if I know it's a feline. So we inherit a lot of we inherit that information from the superordinate category. For example, if I told you that my dog is a corgi, a Welsh corgi, well, you know that Welsh corgi is a one of the many breeds of canine dogs that we have as pets, and you immediately know how big the dog is. You know it's got little stumpy legs, and you know the color. You immediately know a lot. So um, the subordinate categories almost always will inherit the features, properties from the categories that are above it. It makes learning new things a lot easier. So you've got this hierarchy of concepts going from at the top, very general, all the way down to more and more specific. Um, Basically, there is, you have to decide at what point are you going to talk about a particular category, right? So, for example, if you're talking about cats, you're not going to refer to every cat as animal. You're not going to refer to every cat as Morris the cat. You're going to hit someplace in the middle, right? So you're going to call a cat, a dog, a dog. There's a lot of different cars out there, a lot of different vehicles for traveling. There's trucks, pickups, but you're going to call it a car or a truck, right? And these uh, points where we like discuss each category is what's referred to as a basic level concept, and that's where the basic common objects reside. The basic level objects are the things that we commonly refer to within a particular hierarchy on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, these are the concepts that we're using when we talk to kids, when we're teaching kids about different things. We teach kids dog, horse, cat, pony, hippo, giraffe. These are basic uh, concepts, as opposed to something higher level like mammal or animal, or something lower level like the giraffe that you saw in the movie Gladiator, the cat that was walking across the street. You know, uh, it's in between the very high level abstract general and the very low level specific. And that middle level, where we communicate day to day about different categories, are the basic level concepts of each hierarchy. So here's an example here, right? So we have games, we have role playing games, card games, board games, video games. Then we have Dungeons and Dragons, Munchkin, Poker, Monopoly, Ticket to Ride. And then at the bottom, we have different instances of each one of these games. Generally, when we talk about games, we are referring to the middle layer, right? So, I don't say, hey, you want to come over and play role playing games? No, I say, hey, you want to come over and play Dungeons and Dragons? Or hey, let's go, let's play board games. No, no, no. Usually you say, let's play Monopoly, right? um Even, even if you do want to play a particular game, like for example Texas Hold'em, most of the time you'll just say, hey, let's go play poker, and most people nowadays will understand that to be Texas Hold'em. So the superordinate categories, like to poker, for example, the superordinate categories card games. That's too general. And then below poker, we have the subordinate categories to poker, Texas Hold'em and draw poker. That's too specific usually. The basic level concepts in the middle are the ones we generally refer to when we're communicating. One of the things that you have to concern yourself with is, well, where where are these categories stored? Well, they're probably stored as networks of relationships. So you can imagine it like as this interconnected web of concepts that are linked, where related concepts are linked to each other, and this web sort of goes out, and somehow or another it's stored in memory. And we know that's probably the case because I can prime you with one concept, and related concepts will be activated, and then you'll be more liable to recognize those more quickly in the near future. If I ask you about things that are closely related concepts, you can answer those questions pretty quickly. But then if I ask you about something completely different, it takes you a little while to traverse your mental map, your nodes, to get to the new spot. So we know for the most part that there is some sort of like networked set of relationships for how we store our concepts. This notion of cognitive economy is basically related to the idea that conceptual information is stored at the most efficient level of the hierarchy. So, um, that basic concept level approach is that's where we store things at the most efficient level where we can get to it, somewhere in the middle. Um, this notion of networked approaches is has been supported by a lot of research, and it really is the most common foundational theory or framework in cognitive psychology right now. One of the other aspects of organizational approaches is or storing things is through feature comparison. So instead of having this hierarchy of relationships, maybe instead of doing that, we just like compute. We take the features that we're observing in a new thing that we see, and we just compute through some algorithm, matching it with features of things that we know, and then we come up with this category for this particular object. Um, So these types of relationships are computed through feature comparison. They're probably not stored. Um, they're probably not stored in a network like this network that you saw right before. Rather, instead of storing things in this network, every time we come across something or every time we want to categorize something, we just do this feature computation to see where it is relative to, uh, you know, relative to other things we may have experienced. There's pictures in your book of these pictures of brains with these little these little balls of different feature detection areas, I suppose. Um and I don't get the idea that we know what part of the brain like different features are computed, because we don't. One thing that we do know is that conceptual knowledge is definitely widely stored throughout the brain, multiple regions of the brain. There are, some cases where patients do suffer a deficit of particular types of conceptual knowledge. So there's the example in your textbook from Dr. Warrington's patients from 1975. Uh, with these patients with semantic dementia that are suffering the loss of concepts as they progress in their disease. But for the most part, there's no like particular areas of the brain that are associated with particular types of knowledge. We just know that conceptual knowledge involves widespread use of the brain. And here's the picture that I was mentioning to you, this little picture of these little balls. So the take home message of this picture really is that there's a couple of different possible ways that our brain it might be working. The first one is that different features of categories are processed by different areas of the brain. So you have action detectors or action processors, sound processors, motion processors, shape, color, words, and they all sort of work together to come up with this view or this model of what category a particular thing belongs to. The other alternative feature at the bottom is kind of like the first one, but it's very different in one regard. Instead of having all of these distributed different feature detectors, you've got the distributed feature detectors, but then you have a central part of your brain referred to here as the hub that sort of integrates all of the distributed processors, integrates the information to come up with a convergent view of what category, say, a particular object belongs. So, category induction, one of the things that we can do or that we do is we can generalize from what we know about a category to a novel object. And this is basically making inferences about things. So, for example, if I say, hey, can you come over to my house? I'm going to be going on vacation next week. Can you come to my house and look after my cat? Well, right away, if I say cat, I probably don't have a full grown lion, right? It's probably not going to fly. It's probably, not going to, try to eat me. Might scratch me, but it won't eat me. Um, I know roughly how big it is. I know what it eats, right? So right away, I can use my categories to infer, what it is you've got in your house. If I say you have a cat, our world knowledge about how properties are related to each other affects how the types of inferences that we can make, and the types of inferences that we can come up with. Another example of using concepts aside from inducing from categories is, of course, stereotypes. This is where we make inductive inferences about events, objects, people, social situations. A lot of times stereotypes are perceived as negative, but they don't have to be. I mean, we use stereotypes as quick ways of categorizing situations and objects. They're just more efficient. Um, they just make they're a very fundamental and efficient way that we have to interact in social contexts. You're in a, let's imagine yourself in a new situation, and you don't know anybody. But one of the things you're going to be doing is observing people and immediately categorizing them. You're going to be saying, "Oh my God, that woman, she looks like really stuck up, really high maintenance. Oh, that guy looks like a total douchebag. Oh, that guy, he looks like a nice guy. Maybe I can talk to him." Are there two stages to stereotyping, right? That's one of the theories of how stereotypes are related to concepts. So maybe the first stage involves automatic activation of knowledge that we have, that we've stored. Once we automatically activate that knowledge in the first stage, then we would move to the next stage that involves a more controlled and deliberate process where we're able to overcome or explain away some of the uh, some of the initial things that we came up with, the initial processes we came up with, and then correctly understand and categorize the object. To take a negative stereotype, there's probably no group that is more negatively stereotyped than young black men. So if you're somewhere and you come across a young black man, a lot of people have a very negative stereotype, unfortunately, and that'll kick in. But then that's the first stage, right? All the negativity. But then the second stage is where you start evaluating that. You start saying, no, no, this this guy's probably pretty cool. He's probably just like me. He's probably in the exact same situation I'm in or whatever, right? And that's something that one of the things that we can teach people about overcoming some of the negative aspects of stereotypes. Experts are very different from naive people in a lot of different ways. Obviously, expertise. So expertise is defined as a lot of knowledge in a particular area. And there's been a lot of research in trying to understand what it is that makes an expert. Why are experts experts? What is it about their knowledge that makes them experts? Experts, according to Murphy and Wright in '84, experts have a much richer conceptual representations and higher levels of agreement in their feature list. So they have very deep. If you look at the superordinate, subordinate categories, they can go way, way down in subordinate after subordinate category, talking about things at very, very low levels of detail. And a bunch of experts will come up with more or less the same list of features for a particular object. Tanaka and Taylor 91 showed that experts' levels of categorization depends on their level of expertise in a given area. So new experts are going to categorize things much differently than seasoned long-term experts will. Again, based on their experience and the work that they've gone into understanding and processing more information over time. Which approach is correct? Which of these approaches is correct? Well, it's it's hard to say. We don't know. Prototypes, exemplars, world knowledge base, networks, feature processing. None of these approaches can account for all of the findings. So there's a lot more research to do. One of the big areas of research is how children acquire concepts. This is huge. If we can understand how kids between the ages of 0 and say 4 years old acquire concepts, wow, that would be big. Natural versus artificial categories. Is there a difference? Is there a difference between the things we learn day to day living and learning about life and the artificial types of categories that we present in a lab? Abstract concepts versus verbal concepts. Are they different? How are concepts represented in the brain? What parts of the brain are involved? How does it work? These are all um, future areas of research that we will, we'll be investigating probably long after all of us are gone.